All right, let's get rolling. Thank you everyone for joining. I should state the title. Models of Configuration Management is this session. So if you're in the wrong one, happy to jump out, but stay because we got some exciting material to cover. Who am I? I am a PHP developer since 2004. I worked with a variety of PHP frameworks. As of late, I am a Drupal architect at Bounteous. Who are you? I'm assuming that you're a Drupal architect or a site builder working on like a multi-site installation. If you're working with Site Factory, Acquia Site Factory, this is a great fit for you. Or if you're just ready for some abstract thinking, this will be a fun talk. Let's go back in time. Did anyone else do this? So what is this? This is a SQL statement, and it's, I wrote this 2012, so a long time ago, but this was how I was keeping track of changes to the database. I would just write them in a file. If someone else checked out the code, they would just know, okay, pull the database, run this version file. I mean, this is not great. It's not like automated, it's pretty manual, but hey, at least we had some way to take the structure of the state of our application and change it. We could mutate it. I know there are some cases where like people would have to like reach out to a DB admin to actually execute these on production. So like when you deploy your application, you got to corral like totally separate team just to change the structure of your application. Maybe those change sets would have to get communicated like week in advance, 2 weeks in advance. A lot of effort to coordinate just changing the structure of your database. And this is a fundamental aspect of evolving an application. Well, I think something that's really struck me is I don't remember the last time I had to think about the database admin role. Why? Because we're all DB admins now. We have config management. So up DB, export your config, deploy it, everything's grand. So I just wanted to start with a quick appreciation for the fact that I would say this is the second greatest feature of Drupal is the config management system. If you compare it to alternative models or where we've been, this is great. This is great stuff. So let's get excited about config management. Some takeaways for today. There's 4 config synchronization models that I'll cover. There's 4 config split models that I'll cover. With config splits, we'll talk about 5 different ways that you can think about splitting your config, and then guidelines. How do you choose the right model? And the way we'll get there is I'll start with some principles. These are hard-won principles, lessons I've learned. So hopefully it's just some shared experience to help you along the way. Then we'll get into the 2 sets of models, synchronization and split models, and that's like the theory. That's the core of the conversation. And I'll follow up with some guidelines, which are like opinions. Opinions about how you might want to model your config. All right, let's start with principles. Manage your config. Scott Allen has a quote, always version your database. And this is the idea that I started this conversation with. Like, how can you successfully deploy an application without knowing the structure of the data that the application is running against, right? So first principle, use the config management system. It doesn't have to mean that you're managing every aspect of your config, but at some level, could be the site level, install profile, core contrib module. But what are we talking about? What is config? It's a lot of things. Could be site configurations like the site name, performance settings, could be schema like a content type or a field, could be plugin configs for a payment method, search API config. It could also be content. Could be like a block placement. So the idea of configuration is a little squishy. It is a config, as far as Drupal is concerned, it's a config entity. Why do we manage this? Why are we here? I would flip the question, what happens when you don't? What happens when you don't manage config? So have you ever had to make schema changes manually in production just because you didn't have a good way to script it? Maybe it's like a ticket with like, hey, after this deploys, you need to go in and point and click these 5 things. That's prone to error. We're humans. Have you worked with Magento or WordPress or Oro or pretty much any framework that doesn't have an automated config manager? If you're in charge of deploying those applications, you have felt the pain of not having a good way to just make changes, export that config set to some way that's automated and then deploy it in an automated way. With some of these, you end up writing hundreds of lines of update code, and then you have to think about rollback. So a lot of pain. Drupal 7 features. If you've been there, you know some of the frustrations with sometimes it's not idempotent, it's not predictable, and that's a lot of frustration. But maybe sum it up with this problem. It works on my machine. Oh, hey, I forgot to tell you, there's these random 5 steps you got to run before it's going to work. Oh, I forgot, there's 5,000 lines of database migration code I forgot to write. Oh, your feature's not reverting. Did you try a hammer? So this is like the problem, one of the problems we're trying to avoid by managing config. Welcome to the future, Drupal configuration management. Principle 2, always have clean configuration. What does this mean? By default, all configuration is managed. This means when you import configuration, the state of config in your database is matched 1-to-1 with the state of configuration in code. When you export, the opposite. So state of configuration database exported to code. That's what managed is. But you can make it unmanaged. Unmanaged config means you're treating a config entity as state in the database, basically. So it's ignored by import, it's ignored by export. It's treated like a piece of content. If you need to make configuration unmanaged, there's some things you want to keep in mind. You'll add it to your config ignore, which requires config ignore module. You'll add it to export ignore because this just causes confusion. Config ignore doesn't prevent the config entity from being exported to disk. You'll get some feedback from developers on the team. Hey, why is this config showing up? I thought it should be imported. It's not, blah, blah, blah. Well, you can avoid that problem by using config export ignore. You can also, you can actually do this with config split. It's a little complicated. I'm not going to explain it here. Add the config to your allow list. So if you're using config read-only, you want to allow that unmanaged configuration, because the whole point of unmanaged config is you want to be able to change it on production, right? So if you're using config read-only, allow it. This is tricky. If you're using unmanaged configuration and you're in a situation where you're doing new setups, like site installs, you'll want to make sure that those config entities that are ignored, if they're required for running, are in the install profile. And then check your role permissions. So if you want editors to edit web forms and you make it unmanaged, make sure they can access the web form. Properly managed config looks like this. You do drush config status and it says no differences. Bad means you run drush config status and you see a difference. You can also view this in the Drupal admin interface, but always keep your configuration clean. Config that changes needs to be unmanaged. Here's some examples. Block placement. If you're allowing content editors to manage blocks, you probably want to make it unmanaged. Otherwise, next deployment, it's going to revert and the block placement is going to change. Their changes will be undone. Modules that are using config instead of state, really frustrating. There are some that do this. If you find a module that's like just during runtime, it's magically changing your config entities and that's causing your config to be unclean, ignore the module or make it unmanaged. Or maybe you have config that you want the site admin to edit live, like make a menu. Those are some good examples of unmanaged config. The default config set is what's common to all sites. So as we're thinking about modeling configuration, it's important to know what your default config set is. What is the default config set for a site? Simply put, it's whatever you put in your settings PHP. So config sync directory, config sync. There's only one default config set per site. You can't use multiple. By default, your default config set, this is where all config exports to and imports from. So keep that in mind, that term will come up later. And then split sets of configuration off the default set per use case. So some examples, you have an environment and you want specific configuration there. That could be a configuration split. Site, if you got a multi-site scenario and you want specific config on one site, that's a type of split. You could do it by install profile or grouping of functionality like a module. Programmatically disable splits, then enable them. This has bit me a few times. Let's say you have environment splits and you have dev, stage, prod. When you have your settings PHP, disable all of them first and then enable the one you want. This will make sure that nobody, if someone accidentally exports the config split as active and it's accidentally active on all environments, this ensures that you don't run into that situation. Config flows from local to production. Your primary development branch is the canonical source of configuration. Notice I didn't say production database. This is maybe a switch in thinking for some people, but your managed configuration is managed by version control. Version control is the canonical source. So if you're changing config, you don't do it on production, you do it off a branch, make your changes, merge it back in. To help with this, you might consider a reset script. So every time someone changes branches, you run composer install, copy the database, run updates, config import, run it twice, and now you're ready to make changes. Import config twice. I just mentioned that. Why? Here's a little script that I use when I can. The first line, you'll notice the double pipe, and you'll notice that config import is listed here twice. Why? Well, there's a fun issue where the first config import can run into issues when modules are enabled, causing config import to fail and your automated deployment to fail for no reason. It's just a caching issue. So if you run it a second time, that's what the double pipe will do. It'll say, run it once. If it fails, run it again. That's okay. Config import, it's predictable. It's idempotent. It's one of the beautiful things about config management system. The second line is to import config to reflect changes from something like config split. So if you're if you've added a config split, it's not going to get executed on the first time. Sorry, I'm trying to monitor chat. I'm not doing a great job at that. Why not just clear cache first? Ooh, oh man, we'll be here all day if we dig into that one. When you deploy, run opdb as the very, very first thing. Do not run anything else. Don't SQL sanitize. Don't pass go. Run opdb. That's the very first thing you do. After that, sure, you can clear cache. The problem is with config import, if it's enabling a module as part of the import, there are some caching issues. Which ones? I don't know. Talk to me after. I can maybe pull up some notes. I've not seen any indication this is going to change. So if somebody has info on that, please share. All right, ready for the main event. Drum roll, please. Thank you, Animal. 2 categories of config models, synchronization and split models. What are the difference? Well, as we've been talking about, synchronization, that's for your default config set. And there's ways to structure it when you have multiple sites on the same Drupal install. Split models, just splitting out differences. You'll pick one synchronization model and then layer on whatever split models you like. So let's start with config sync models. There are 4. Globally shared management. This is the default. This means that all sites share that config set. And I'll show a diagram for each of these if it's not clear what that looks like. Profile shared management. So this means that you've got groups of sites, and within a group, based on the install profile, it's sharing the same config set. And then separate management. Every site would have its own config set. And then unmanaged, which is you're not synchronizing config at all. So the first model, globally shared. This is default. So in your settings PHP config sync directory is config sync. Any site 1, 2, or 3, import, export, it's all go into the same spot. Profile shared management. This one gets a little more fancy. So what we're doing here, we're taking the profile's custom, whatever your profile name is, and you're declaring that as your sync directory. There's a little gotcha, like that has to be a symlink back to your config directory. Whole separate discussion about why that is. And then for, like you can see in the diagram, site 1, it uses install profile A. So import, export from that profile A directory. Sites 2 and 3, profile B. Separate management. Each site is basically its own install. Completely separate functionality. There's nothing shared unless you have some kind of split. This gets a little complicated. You have to worry about UIDs of your config. Yeah, you have to worry about your UIDs of your config model, or config, like if you're doing config splits. So taking a step back from like that specific problem, conceptually, this is a model you could employ, but you're effectively treating every site as a completely unique install. They're just sharing a code base. Just to clarify, we've synced between dev environments. Could this also apply to sites within an environment for multi-sites? Sorry, if you could rephrase the question, Jessica. We'll come back to that. Model 4, unmanaged, so nothing's managed. We'll touch on this later, but this is the sweet spot. If you have like 1,000 sites on one code base, you want to manage towards this. This is the golden ticket to happy management of your site. Config split models. Okay, so we've got our synchronization. How do we handle differences? There's at least 4 common scenarios I've seen. Environment splits. So you want dblog enabled on dev, but you don't want it on prod. Site splits. you've got two sites sharing the same config sync directory, but you want to change the site name. You do a site split. Profile splits. You have a couple of sites who have a blog content type, a couple of sites with the brochure content type. You don't want them to have the same. You could split out that config set based on the install profile. And then you can apply kind of a similar model, but on like a module level. All right, let's look at 4 examples just to solidify what that looks like. Environment splits. So imagine we've got site 1, and we're looking at dev stage prod. And on dev, we do a config import. Well, what's going to happen, it's going to read from that default sync directory, and then it's going to apply whatever your overrides are from the dev split. And then same for stage, same for prod. So that's in the gist of what environment splits are doing. With profile splits, imagine we've got globally shared management. So we have 3 sites, all with the same default config set. We want to, like that blog post scenario, we want profile A to have a blog post. Profile B, we want to have a brochure content type. Well, you can do that with profile splits. So profile A has the blog and profile B has the brochure content type. On config import for site 2, it's, they're all reading from the default sync, but on import, remember in that settings PHP where you're writing the logic to activate one split or another, that's where the magic happens that says, hey, this is the split that should be active. Site splits with globally shared management, applying the same idea, but in this case, maybe you want the contact email to be different. So site 1, site 2, site 3, they each have their own split just for the site contact email. So you can manage it that way. And then site splits with profile shared management. So the profile shared management, if you've got 10 sites on a single profile, you might want to customize the site name or something like that. And if that's something you care about and want to manage, you could use a site split to do so. And we can't talk about splitting config without talking about different ways that you can do that. And there's at least 5. You could do no split, obviously. That's the default. What that means is when you import and export, it's reading from your default sync directory. You can do a complete module split. And this one's special in that when you complete split a module, it only enables that module for the scenario where that split is active. So take dblog. If you complete split it for your dev split, dblog would never have any config in the default sync. Your core.extensions in the default sync would never have dblog enabled. You would only see it enabled on dev, and any config entities for dblog module would all get exported to the dev split. Complete entity split works kind of similar, but it's not happening on the module level. Like you're choosing a very specific entity to split out. So like, let's take a web form. Say you have a web form, it's a contact form, and you want it only to exist on one site. Well, you could complete split that so it exists on one site, but it's not in the default sync, so it doesn't exist on any other site. Conditional split, imagine that same web form, but in this case, we have 10 sites. All of them have this web form, but we want to customize it for one site. You could conditional split it, meaning that entity is in the default directory, so every site gets it, but then for that one site you want to customize, it'll read from that split. And then unmanaged, it's just never synchronized. Only exists in the database. All right, let's look at some examples of what those splits might look like. No split, I hope this is kind of obvious. Imagine config entity A. If sites 1 and 2 share the same sync directory. It's everywhere. It's on site 1, it's on site 2, it's in the default in the sync. Complete split. So here we have a module, and that module has config entities A and B. That module will only be enabled for site 1, and those config entities will only exist in the database and in the split directory for site 1. It won't be in the default sync directory, and site 2 doesn't get it. Complete entity split, similar idea, but it doesn't happen on the module level. So A, config entity A, only in the site split directory and only in the database for site 1. And then conditional split. So config entity A, it's in the default directory, site 2 has it, but site 1, it's got an override. And that override only exists in its database and in that site split. Unmanaged. So you can have a specific config entity that's unmanaged, in which case that config entity, it's not in the sync directory, it's in no one's database except the one database you created it in. So if site 1 or in a managed entity is a web form, somebody went into production and actually created that config entity on site 1. This is the part where I share some opinions. And hopefully it'll be really valuable. I'm actually most excited about this part because I think it elicits some fun conversations about how do you do Drupal with many sites, or even just how do you approach thinking about when to use a particular split or not. So that's the point of this section. And let's start with synchronization models. So I have a couple opinions here. They're somewhat shared, like I've pulled this from some conversations with other people. So one opinion is 80% of a default config set should be shared by all sites. What does that mean? So if you have a multi-site setup and there's 12 content types, let's say 10 of those are managed config. So you care about every change. If you add a field, you're doing that in code and pushing that up, but 2 are unmanaged. I don't know what those would be, maybe like a staff profile or something. And you're not gonna make changes to those config entities. That means 10 are managed. That's our baseline. So 80% would be 8 content types, should be shared by all sites. Why? This principle is just a proxy for how difficult it will be to manage your application. So if you run into a scenario where you have, 8 content types that you're managing, but they're like specific to particular sites, then that's a huge burden, effort burden. Managed config does not scale well with the number of sites. So this will take some thought, but imagine you've got one site. With that site, 90% of the config you're managing. So all the contact forms, all the content types, performance config, block placement, all of that, you're managing all of it. You can probably do that with reasonable effort with one site. As soon as you get to 2 to 5 sites, you probably want to start thinking about making certain configurations unmanaged. Site contact email, maybe that becomes unmanaged. Maybe you make some of the site metadata unmanaged. Maybe you make some web forms unmanaged, whatever. But in order to manage it, manage 5 sites successfully, you probably don't want to have to manage every piece of configuration. Just in practice, it gets kind of hard. Once you get to 6 to 20 sites, keep bringing that number down, start caring less about config. So what do you really care about managing for those 20 sites? Maybe it's fields and content types. And then once you get above 20, it's hard. It's hard to manage that much config for so many sites. And that's when you start talking about like install profiles. Another way to frame this is like collectible sites versus commodity sites. A collectible site, you care about it. You care about everything about that collectible. Even its dents and bruises you care about. A commodity site, you don't. It's, you know, if one particular site is not configured right, delete it, create a new one. Here's a fun chart. So take that idea, and here's a visualization that is attempting to capture that. So go back to our config management synchronization models. Under the model where every site has a separate configuration directory, you're probably managing a lot of config for all the sites. That does not scale well. You can do it for a couple of sites, right? But you're probably managing like 90% or better of each of those sites' configurations. So I would say do that with like less than 10 sites. With globally shared, because all the sites are starting to share the same configuration, like you can make a config change once and just roll that out to all the sites. With the globally shared, that becomes a little more manageable. So you can probably get to, you know, 20 sites or something with reasonable effort. But you're also caring less about how much control you have over the config. With profile shared, you take a step further, and I think profile is a pretty big jump, because at this point you're having multiple sets of configuration, and that in itself is hard to manage. Like multiple install profiles in the same code base, it increases the complexity way up, because you're dealing with like modules and just all kinds of nuances, upgrades, all that. Yeah, so that's complicated. You want to care less about how much config you manage, but you can probably do that well for, you know, 100+ sites. Unmanaged, I mentioned this before, this is the sweet spot. This is your like WordPress.com, point and click, create a site, leave, you know, set and forget. Let the content editors create new content types. Why do you care? You don't, right? Like this is this scenario, the thing you're building with Drupal is a site building platform at that point. Split models. This handy diagram I just put together to kind of conceptualize the fact that profile shared model does not work with profile splits, right? Doesn't make sense. And then separate, if each site you're managing separately, you have no need for a site split. So probably not a very useful diagram, but here it is. I'm actually going to spin through this here because I want some time for questions. But what I've done here is I've given a few combination scenarios and what I think you probably want to be thinking about for like how much config to manage, how many sites I'd work with. So globally shared with site splits, you probably don't want to do it with a ton of sites, but you can manage like up to 100% of the config if you wanted to. Globally shared with profile splits, you probably don't want to care as much because you have no way to isolate site-specific config. But you can manage more sites with it. And same with profile shared. And then unmanaged being, again, kind of the golden ticket. This is another fun diagram. So you're going to have conversations about, all right, here's a module. Do we complete split it? Do we make it unmanaged? Do we do conditional split? This diagram I've actually referred back to several times. The first question I ask, is it editable on production? Because if you're going to edit on production, no other questions need asked. It's unmanaged config. So that becomes easy. There are some nuances if you have to deal with it's unmanaged on some sites and not on others. That's a whole can of worms, but let's just keep it simple. So, and then let's say you're not editing on production, you're going to use a managed config strategy. So that could mean that if the module owning the config is enabled on all sites, so let's say web form module, 100 sites have it. I need to flip that. Let's say web form is only enabled on one site. You want to complete split, right? Because that's how you get the module only enabled on one site. But if the module is on every site, that's when you get to the next question: are all config entities the same? So you have a contact form. That contact form is the same on every site. You don't have to split it. Just put it in the default directory, enable the module for all sites, you're done. But what if at least one site has a different value? Well, is that value for the same config entity? If so, you can do a conditional split. So that contact form, it exists on every site, but there's one specific site that wants to override that one contact form. You could do a conditional split on that config entity. And then complete split would be, okay, that contact form, every module has web form enabled, but this one site has this contact form, no one else does. All right. A lot of material, but I hope you all find it useful. To recap, there's 4 synchronization models. You'll pick one of these. There's 4 config split models. It's really common to use environment splits. If you use site splits, keep in mind that you're managing more config. Profile splits, if you're dealing with a lot of sites, then that becomes a better alternative than site splits. And then module splits, that's kind of a theoretical thing. Like features basically kind of does this, and that has some specific use cases. 5 ways to split your config: no split, complete module, complete entity, conditional entity, and unmanaged. And then you can refer back to those decision aids that I showed. So thank you. There are slides. Let me see if I can copy link address. You can check those out. And if you want to talk, my handle is Joseph D. Purcell. I'm on Drupal Slack. Find me on LinkedIn, Twitter. Happy to chat more. And if you want to have some further reading, there's some slides here. We have a couple minutes. Let's do some questions. So I saw one. What if config is enabled on all sites, but the value is different in one site? Okay, so Vishal, if a config is enabled on all sites, but a value is different on one site, that's a conditional split, because the entity exists everywhere, but one site has a variation of it. How to manage multiple dev teams working on one repository? Whew, good night. That's a tough one. Sorry, I'm going to do a cop-out, not within scope of this talk. I'd be happy to talk more later, though. Block configuration quandary. We want to keep block configuration unmanaged in production, so content editors can change things, but how do we use config management to deploy staged changes that involve blocks? So there's a module that lets you programmatically import a config file or like a directory of configs. If someone has a link to that module, please put it in chat. So I would say if you need to, like, if you're allowing content editors to manipulate block config, you just have to assume like you don't have control over that anymore. But if you do need to make a change, you could do an update hook Yeah. Okay, how is unmanaged the golden ticket? Imagine you have 1,000 sites and you're like, people have administrative access to Drupal for those 1,000 sites. There's no guarantees. All bets are off. So if you want to add a field to a content type, first of all, there's no guarantee that content type exists. There's no guarantee that field doesn't exist already, or it hasn't been changed. You just have no guarantees once you start dealing with that many sites. So unmanaged removes the management burden from your team. How to manage the configurations if content manager wants to add languages dynamically. I would offhand, I think I would have to say you have to define all your languages up front. And then on a piece of content, they should be able to create a piece of content for that language. But yeah, that one sounds, because translations penetrate a lot of config. So I wouldn't try doing that dynamically, but that's just offhand thoughts. Does config management 2.0 change any of this? I had the same question. Based on my investigation, no. These config models, they're models, and they would apply, like the specifics of how they work and how you, like I didn't show config, like I didn't show a settings PHP to show like how that works. Those details probably will change, I'm guessing, but I don't think the models will. Like probably the big one is the module splits that I mentioned. I think that is gonna, I'm interested to see where CMI2 goes with that. All right, scrolling through. The link to the slides is empty. Okay, yep. All right. Do you manage your configs in VCS like Git? If so, how do you handle small changes that can conflict? Yeah. So I guess this is a implicit challenge of developing with config management. You probably don't want multiple people on the same code repository making config changes in the same area or installing modules, because a module could install and modify all your content types. So if one person's working on, you could have 3 people working on content types. One person installs a module, changes all the config, and you have to redo all that work, right? So as you're planning your work, consider isolating, like create work streams based on around your config. Yeah, config conflicts they're difficult. Can you confirm if you end up with UUID and the exported config in your profile model? So I think there's a whole talk here just about how do you make this work, right? This is more like focused on theory. I think it's hard to talk about without looking at like exact code, but I will say that all sites that share a config sync directory, I think what I've been doing is I think they all have the same UUID for the site. I'd have to double check that, but that's a good question. Yeah. All right. All right, did I miss any questions? Okay. All right, thanks everybody. Hey, yeah, I would love to hear more. I'd love to chat more. So find me, Drupal Slack. I'd love to hear your thoughts. We'll chat sometime. Appreciate everybody coming. Oh yeah, please give feedback too. I'd love to hear how I did.